Welcome to Best Wellness Interviews, where I interview successful people and they share their experiences and their strategies around health and well-being. I'm Kristine Best, wellness strategist, and I am your host today. Today, my guest is Patrick Eilers. Did I say that correctly? Patrick
Yep.
Eilers,
Patrick Eilers. Yep.
and he's from Michigan in the US. Welcome to my show, Patrick.
Well, thanks, Christine. Really appreciate an opportunity to be here and to talk more about wellness and a lot of the different topics that we're going to talk about today.
This interview is going to be different to a lot of the interviews that I've done on my podcast so far because you come from a different approach or a different angle. But it is equally as powerful as any of the others that I've interviewed. So you are a counsellor
Mhm.
by profession, but you got into a niche area where you're helping businesses create a better culture. And I like that. That's really fantastic. Would you like to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and how you actually got into that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So like Christine said, my name is Patrick Eilers. I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the United States, in the state of Michigan. Been a counselor for about 10 years. I've worked in a variety of different settings in the field. I've worked in the specialty space with addiction. I've worked kind of as a general practitioner, been an adjunct professor, kind of done a bunch of different stuff in the field over the last 10 years in different areas. Worked kind of with all ages, all different groups, people, worked with couples, kind of a large range of things I've done. In 2024, I decided to start my own business. My business is called Bloomberg's Concepts and Coaching. And the idea behind Bloomworks really has been about really helping, like Christine said, kind of change some of these things when it comes to practice culture within the mental health field. One of the things that we have in Michigan specifically is that there's a high range of turnover of therapists. And so one of the things that kind of has always spoken to me is that a lot of the practices I worked for is that I've always felt like there was things that they could do better. And to have healthier places for the therapists to be able to thrive as therapists. Because if therapists want to be at work, they're going to be able to do a better job of helping and supporting clients that are coming into the practices. So that kind of really where I started. It was really more about my kind of my own personal experience there. But as a therapist, I mean, I really wanted to see people's lives be changed. In this case, I want to see some businesses and things in that way thrive because, like I said, a lot of these practices don't always have great healthy cultures and are good places for the therapist to feel supported in that way. So a lot of those things kind of came from my own experiences.
What I would like to ask you is, do those organisations that didn't have healthy cultures, did they actually support their therapists, people that work there? Because therapists are helping people and
Hmm.
hearing really bad stories about people's lives and what's upsetting them, that can be quite negative and
Absolutely.
weigh heavily on certain types of personality. And so did those organisations support people to debrief, to be counselled themselves, or not counselled even, but to be coached, to offload that kind of stuff?
Yeah, to be supported, I think is really kind of that's the big thing that is lacking in some organizations for sure. In my experience, I guess I'd say the two things that really kind of came up is number one, as a therapist, you're taught to really be able to find your way. And so I think as an owner, a lot of times it's difficult to not feel like you are trying to bring more people in. It's hard to find people that you align with as far as everybody's on the same page and kind of working and rowing in the same direction, so to speak. So a lot of places I worked with, would even though the owners might have been really great owner or like really good therapists, they struggle being owners because they tend to look at it as, well, if no one's saying anything or no one's really complaining or there's like a need necessary to try to be an owner in those moments, I don't necessarily have to check in and do those kind of things. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's always good to have everybody kind of being on the same page as much as you can within your control. And so one of the things is that I would always like I feel like it'd be very supportive is to make sure that everybody's kind of brought in on the same idea. Okay, what's the direction we're heading as a clinic? What are the people that we're trying to work toward? How do we support each other? And just in kind of the camaraderie of being able to be a team together. I did work for a couple places that have had a pretty good, strong team cohesion, but that didn't always necessarily translate necessarily into the fact that the owners were always like on a regular basis being owners. There were certainly people who were better at that than others, and would make more time for that. But ultimately, it comes down to I always think about if you're going to be an owner of a practice, you have to recognize that you're going to give up some clinic time that you have for yourself to be an owner. And it's really important to be able to wear both of those hats. And you have a lot of those same clinical skills across the board, but you need to be able to make the time to be an owner. And a lot of owners, I feel like, want to be therapists and they kind of want to close the door. And when they close the door, then their ownership is kind of done. And unfortunately, it's one of those things when you add, as an owner, when you add that to your part of your job description, yeah, you have to be an owner the other percent of the time that you're not a clinician. So it's not like you can necessarily stop being an owner. You just have to learn how to be able to be one effectively on a regular basis. And that's something that a lot of clinicians struggle with, at least in my experience.
Yeah, a lot of owners think that they just got to control the business side of it, but the people are the ones that actually make your business. They're the
Absolutely.
ones that bring your business. So if you're not
Hmm.
caring for them and looking after them and making sure that they're well, then uh, they're going to start taking. Well, they're going to first of all they display things like um, disconnection or disengagement, and then it's stress, and then it's you know
Hmm.
leading to time off, that sort of thing. Are they indicators that you would be looking for if you were coaching people in business?
Well, I still don't think burnout's usually a word that a lot of people talk a lot about. Certainly the idea that, if your therapists are burning out, that's a pretty good indication that there's probably something going on.
Well,
The other one I probably was,
if they're
I'm
turning
sorry.
over, if they're turning
Turning
over,
over. Yep, that
then
would be another one for sure.
that's kind of a kind of a burnout.
Yep. Yeah. So turnover, burnout, I think really certainly, the clinicians who feel like they're taking more and more on, but they're not necessarily getting more of their own time. There's always a balance as a clinician. You have to be able to, take a certain amount of time for yourself to be able to, fill up your bucket again because your bucket empties pretty quickly. You
Mm.
mentioned it earlier, and you're carrying a lot of burden of things that you have to be able to know how to balance that. Yes, there's always a financial element of that. Like a lot of people want to see more people so that they can make more money, obviously, but there needs to be a balance there, and that's just, being in a healthy culture, I think, is respecting that balance, certainly in that way. Um, I think also as an owner, it's important to really make sure that you're aware of all your clinicians, or at least most of your clinicians, knowing kind of what is the main goal of the clinic, meaning that, you can hire a bunch of people who have their own perspective, and that's not a bad thing. But if you hire, let's say you hire five different people and they all have different perspectives on how to do therapy, that can sometimes cause a clash within the team. So understand everybody kind of has the same goal of what the main idea of the practice is trying to do. What is the outcome of the practice? What is are we training clinicians? Are we here to, meet a specific, criteria for the population we're working with, stuff like that. So those are some things I think I look for, especially when you're talking about like, do we find this as all being cohesive in that way, or do we look at it as basically kind of fragmented? Because that's one of the other things I think as an owner, a lot of times people will feel like, well, we're trying to, cast a wider net, but the more the cast of the wider net that you do, the more likely that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have people kind of going rogue and doing their own thing, and that doesn't necessarily bring culture that's consistent for the practice. It just ends up that's what creates a lot of the turnovers. You got people going, a bunch of different directions, and it doesn't really ultimately serve the purpose of the people that they're there to serve.
I think it's going to be a difficult task in a way because what I see is every person is different. And so you have all these different people coming into the practice with different kinds of issues that they want, mental health issues they want solved, right? And so every one of those will require something slightly different with the approach to help that person,
Right.
depending on what it is they're, they're suffering from. But also, then you're dealing with all these different therapists, and all of them have their own personalities and their own way they've
Yeah.
been educated, the way they like to work themselves. So I think you don't necessarily want to quite the personal flair that they have. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But
Yeah.
I understand that there might be some uh, ways in which the practice wants to operate that might be respected a bit more than, just going willy-nilly whichever direction
Right.
you want. How do you find that balance?
Yeah, so I think if there really, so like in the case of if you have a practice that is meeting the needs of a lot of different areas of the population, like you spoke to, diversity would certainly be something you want to, try to find as much of it as you can. You want to have that be able to cast, like I said, cast a wider net that way. But I think the more specialized you get, especially if you start working with a specific population exclusively, then you really want to try to find people who are much more in tune with what the system is going to be.
Mm,
So just speaking from my experience when I was a specialist, that particular practice had a specific way they wanted to do something. And so it's
mm,
difficult to necessarily bring in people in if you've worked in a certain system or you have a certain comfortability with something. You want to hire people who are going to align with wanting to work in that system, even if they don't understand the system, coming into it. They kind of have to learn it because that's a specific way they do that. So I think it's important to really, find the people who you know are going to be willing to do that within the reason that you can do. Obviously interviewing a certain way and asking the kind of questions you need to ask so that you can be able to find that group of people who are going to be able to align with what the vision of that practice is. Now, to go back to your point, how do we find that balance? Well, I think it really comes down to the vision of the practice. If the practice's vision is to be very specific, then yes, then you have to approach that differently than you would if you're looking as a generalist. If you're looking at a generalist, then maybe the idea is, okay, how many people can we get that are going to be aligned in how do they see clients? How do they see mental health do they see it more as a diagnosis? Do they see it as a relationship? Do they see it as opportunity? How do they see mental health in that way? And I think that's a way you can kind of bring some cohesion there. But I would agree that if you're going to be in a generalist kind of state, then you're going to need as much diversity as you can because you will be able to affect a greater amount of people. But I think then that comes back to then how do you help then create and foster in that diversity a place where all of the clinicians feel like they have a place to be in there and that they are important members of that team. Because I think that's where sometimes you can get pretty isolated if you have a large team of people, because you kind of get lost in the shuffle of just kind of everybody, just doing different things. And so it's important then to kind of identify, okay, like how do we value those clinicians that are there? And that can look a lot of different ways. Some of it's financial, some of that's, providing extra opportunities for training, learning, growth, whatever that looks like. Maybe it's a little bit of both, to be able to maintain those clinicians in that particular space.
So, do these organisations actually uh, get the person who wants to leave, the therapist that's going to leave, do they
Yeah,
have a little survey that asks them to complete? Because that would then tell them, they can ask the
Yeah,
question, so why are you leaving? Was it something about this place, or is it because you're looking for something better? And then they can find out why people are leaving. Because if you know why
for
people are
sure.
leaving, then you know what you can do about it.
Right.
And then you know also who you can hire to avoid that attrition.
hmm Yeah, I never had an exit interview in most of my places I've worked at. And so that's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's standard, but I wouldn't say it's not standard either. I think it depends on where you end up. But I would definitely agree with that. I think you have to have some kind of exit interview or exit kind of, or at least to kind of walk out of, okay, what is really the main concern here? Because the other thing that does seem to happen is, at least from my experience, is that a lot of places will hire prematurely. They think or they expect there's going to be growth when there really is no evidence of the growth being maintained. And mental health is very one of those fields where there's periods where you'll get a lot of new clients for a short period of time, and then it'll drop off for a while. It just kind of goes up and down. It's very rare to have it be like, consistently progressively up or progressively down. It kind of tends to go up and down, just kind of like almost like a EKG kind of monitor. So it's one of those kind of things where if you project that you're going to have, let's say you're going to get an extra 30 clients that you're expecting to have. And that's just a round number, but the reality is, let's say you project that that's the next 30 clients. You have to know that, okay, after those 30 clients, what happens beyond that? Because if I hire a clinician and let's say I get 30 new clients, but only 20 of those clients stay, I've just guaranteed this clinician or somewhat guaranteed this clinician 30 hours when really I can't give that. And
Yep.
so what happens sometimes, a lot of these places online, this is really where I've seen this, really starting to change with a lot of online therapy, is they'll hire you on a roster essentially. So they have a roster of clinicians. They don't necessarily bring you people. They wait till those people are there. And when they have those people, then they start to give them to you depending on where the location that you're hired in. And the problem with that is that they don't have enough of the clinician, they don't have enough clients coming in for a clinician to fill up a caseload. So, you bring these people on prematurely and then you end up having a lot of turnover simply because they don't make enough money to be able to survive. So that's the other side of it is that as an owner, what are you doing to make sure you're maintaining enough clients to come in the business to be able to sustain being able to expand. Because otherwise, you'd be better off as the owner to connect with other clinics in the area to refer people to. Yes, you might lose business in the short term, but in the long term, you're actually going to do yourself better because you'll be able to maintain as a reputation of being a good clinic. And when you bring somebody new in, you can maintain those clients that way. So there are ways that you can do that to improve it. It's just a lot of places don't necessarily do that. It takes a lot of extra legwork and time to do those kind of things and build those relationships. And a lot of times it's also looked at as like, am I helping the competition? When really I'm probably helping myself in the short term by doing things like that.
Mm. The other thing is that a lot of people who need mental health therapy, they don't they don't take the action to go and get the
Right.
help. They sometimes deny they've got a problem, or for
Mhm.
whatever reason, the stigma
Yeah,
attached to mental health. All of those things stop people from going to a clinic to get help. They don't want to be
for
seen
sure.
walking to a mental health clinic. So
Mhm.
there are those kind of challenges that a business owner would have to face as well.
Yeah, it's not like a traditional sense that you have a consistent amount of people all the time, and you're kind of gonna have different seasons and different periods where those are going to increase or decrease, like you said. And it is hard to always know, like to predict that. You can do the best you can with some of those things, but you kind of work from like excuse me, this is kind of what we're hoping to have, but doesn't necessarily mean it's going to guarantee. And I don't necessarily I use the word guarantee very lightly because I do think that there's a lot of times where, as an owner, people will be very honest, like, hey, I'm not sure we're going to have these clients here. We're going to do what we can do to try to get there. And I know there is some level of that does that fall onto the clinician to be able to also help themselves find some people. And I know definitely as a contractor, there's definitely a little bit of an expectation that, you want more clients, you should also be able to help yourself get those. And that's always been something where just personally I always kind of struggle with that a little bit because like I'm working for this other place as an employer, even if I'm a contract employer, I'm still there to help. I'm working for them, so I do feel like there's a level of their responsibility to be able to help, being able to bring those people in with what they can. So um, it is a little bit of an unusual space just because it's not like any other business in that way, and it's pretty
No,
unique in that for that sense.
yeah. There was something else I was going. Oh yeah, when you're helping these business owners and the practice, do you get involved in making sure they have uh, a written infrastructure, like a framework, and procedures and things like that? Do you get into that part of it?
So I have developed a lot of those kind of things. Yeah. So I have like a four-pillared system. So essentially, what's your vision? What's your why, so to speak? What's your purpose of your practice? And then I have
Hmm.
an operations section, which is really based on some manufacturing things as far as structuring how to structure a practice. Then I have a pay structure, like how do you pay your clinicians? It's a pay structure based on basically essentially there's three tiered system. So, if you got self-pay or insurance, it basically just it breaks those up in a way that you can see it differently and visualize it differently. And then basically the last one is really essentially it could help somebody retire. How do you close your practice? How do you hand it off to somebody else? What do you do when you decide to leave a legacy, that kind of thing. So really, I could from start to finish, in theory, start set a practice up
Right.
if I was given the opportunity to do that. But from the perspective of that, I'd want to try to cover as much as I could so that I
Sure.
could make it flexible enough for where anybody needed that. So it's very adaptable to wherever the person is. They don't have to use my system in order to make it work. It's mostly just let's use this as like you said, a framework or a structure for that.
Yeah, a starting point anyway. They just
Sorry,
start.
what did you say?
It's a starting point anyway for them.
Right.
Gives
Yeah.
gives them things to think about. And I'd
Yep.
imagine that some of these practices started off with just perhaps the owner, and then they've
Mm,
brought somebody else in and somebody else in. And so the business wasn't set up right for employing people. And there
right.
that's a problem can exist because, there's not the same framework as if it was built and, before you start. It's sort of just,
Yes.
you find that?
Yeah, a lot of people, when they do start individually, right? That's like you said, they expand from individual. So something that might work for them, solo is not going to work in a group practice all the time. The other thing is that when you're coming from a therapy perspective, a lot of people will use some structures from like sessions, like the way you structure a session into how you structure a business, and that doesn't work either because they're two different entities. And so a lot of times you'll see stuff that kind of not necessarily crosses over, but certainly is a situation where in a smaller setting that has worked, but now you've got, if you have admin or support staff, if you've got additional clinicians, you said you got to start making those adapting the business now to being a little bigger or different kind of framework because it needs different type of support. And sometimes there's a I think a mindset for most clinicians because they don't have that training. It's kind of, well, it works even if it doesn't work great, it works, and then we're just going to kind of keep doing it. And so there's this a little bit of a mindset of, I might not like it, it may not be ideal, but I don't want to take the time to figure anything else out, so I just might as well keep going forward with it. So you run into a lot of those kind of things too, where a lot of it, I get a lot of that on like LinkedIn where you'll share stuff and people are like, well, this is, really good or interesting or a need or whatever, but people stepping into it, I think is a bit of a challenge as far as like wanting them to really take a review on it and look at it and try to understand it.
So I would imagine you can coach business people pretty much anywhere in the world.
Yep, that's the nice thing about being a coach is you really have the ability to be able to go anywhere. You're not limited to a license. So certainly across the world, I would say the mental health field is a little bit different in other places, but as far as it more so probably in the pay structure than really anything else. So I definitely have, certainly could work with anybody around the world if they were interested.
Yeah. I think it's a good thing because you don't want to have high turnover of your staff because the person who came to get help wanted to stay with that person. So you might
Hmm.
lose the employee, but you also might lose the client.
Oh yeah. Yep. Yeah, the clients, that's one of the things I've heard many times in different places I've worked at. Like I've gotten some clients who've worked with two or three therapists before they met me. And so it's like, it's kind of it definitely interrupts continuity of care. It interrupts rapport building. If
Mm,
you are someone who believes, like I do, that the relationship is part of the healing process, if not a majority of the healing process, then you need to value the relationships you have with your clinicians that you hire and those relationships that are the extension. Earlier, you talked about, our clinicians are the extension basically of your business and what you have in the community. So if you hire clinicians that are competent and that are going to fulfill your vision, though they have to continue to sort of stay in that space because they are the extension of what your practice is going to be, long term. And so that's
mm,
something that's really important, I think, because bringing somebody in who's competent that you like as a clinician does not necessarily always mean they're going to be the best person that's going to fit for that, for what you want to do and how you want to be the extension in that way to the community. So I do think it's important to, factor in some of those things when you're, considering expand and bring more people onto your team.
yeah, because a customer who comes in, I'm not sure whether you call them customers or patients or whatever,
Patients or clients typically, yeah. Yeah.
client is a nicer word. So when a person comes for help, it takes time to build a relationship with someone, and they quite often have personal issues going on that they wouldn't share with just anybody, and they'd have to trust that therapist, and so that's an important part of that relationship for them
Mhm.
to feel. They have to trust the person they're dealing
Yep.
with.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always look at therapy as like an opportunity, essentially. Like what I do is I facilitate opportunity for healing. And so basically when people come in and the doors close, that's their opportunity to heal or to talk about whatever it is that they want to talk about or to go through or work through whatever they want to. I kind of look at the same way with coaching, but certainly, as a clinician, you look at that more from a diagnostic perspective, at least in that sense that the facilitation of opportunity is really about what heals, what helps a person heal and grow. And so, in that same idea, the people that you do bring in that are clinicians, have to be able to work from the perspective that that's part, and again, that's just my perspective. I was owning a practice. That's the people I want who fit something of that similar type of mindset. Now, it might not be exact and they're going to have different training and whatnot, but do they have the general vision that relationship is a major part of the component of healing? And so if that's true, those are people that I would want to work for me because that's going to extend my therapeutic presence from the way I see it to now other rooms and now to other people, and it's going to expand out and kind of spider web from there. And that's kind of the way I look at it, is like if you're going to be a really strong clinic, you should have a solid reputation in the community for whatever it is your vision is. Whether it be that, if it's something specialized or if it's something just as in a general sense. Um, I think it's important to have that because it does take the sort of therapeutic heart, so to speak, and extend it beyond just the initial contact, I guess is probably a way to say that.
What do you think of psychometric testing for the therapist? Because if your clinic wants someone who's of a certain, um, I don't know, mindset, a certain attributes that they have to fit in with this clinic and their direction,
Yeah.
do you think psychometric testing is the answer for that?
I actually just saw a LinkedIn post just a little bit ago about just today about like here's the licensure sort of qualifications and what's the character qualifications, and that's kind of what you're speaking to is like I don't know that that would be something you'd want to have maybe necessarily in an interview. You might find ways to try to word things or to ask questions that are related to character issues. Um, I do think that, from a licensure perspective, there probably is some benefit to having some of those kind of tests relating to your character and to the person that you are and those kind of things. But I think as an owner, like that's one of the things that are you asking the kind of questions, are you vetting for the right kind of stuff that's character-based stuff? In my experience, most of the interviews I've had are related more to like my licensure and the liability of licensure and what does that look like and what is your therapeutic, orientation, so to speak. What modalities do you know? What modalities do you work with? And if you don't necessarily, again, sometimes that fits what people are looking for, sometimes it isn't. But I think ultimately when it comes to character, like you're going to see, again, some turnover is related to character, sometimes it's not, but in most cases with a clinician, character is really going to come through in how you get the sense that they interact with other people, including yourself as the owner. If they are, somebody who likes to do this stuff on their own, then they probably, if you're a clinic who wants to have more community, and you're within the practice, then that person may not be a great fit in that way. Uh, do I think that those tests can definitely add more validity to that because you're going to get a better sense of what the person, may find important. But I do think that it's going to come out. You're going to see it within the period of observation or what time you make to build that relationship with that clinician. And I think that's an ongoing process. That's not something you can just, and that's why I kind of meant before is like owners don't necessarily do that. Sometimes it's easy to like make the relationship initially and then like let the person kind of just keep going on their trajectory. But as an owner, like it's my responsibility now to have that relationship with the clinician ongoing. Like that's something I have to keep trying to work toward. Because I don't just bring them on as sort of my as like I said, my employee just to kind of just keep doing their own thing. It's about trying to help them become, you know, more in tune with me and what we're doing and kind of those things if they're willing to do that. Obviously, there's a limit to what that it looks like, but um, in my opinion, I feel like it's important as an owner to try to have that bridge as much as you can.
Sure. And because those people are going to work together, they're going to see each other throughout the day and they need to
Sure.
be able to get on with everyone and communicate well with each other. And you don't want some odd person, an odd personality out it because they're not going to fit in with the rest of the group.
Yeah.
They all to be able to come together. And I'd imagine having think tanks and brainstorming sessions together would be of value. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. Yep. I think that really is something that is underestimated a lot of the time. Part of it is because when you go through the process of you getting your license, at least in the United States anyway, and I don't know if this is true for other places, but there's a long process of supervision. And so a lot of people have had negative supervision experiences. And so they're not really that excited about being supervised by somebody, above them or whatever the case is. So when you get to a point when you're fully licensed, most of the time you can kind of start to do what you'd like to do and kind of your way and find your part to the art, so to speak. But I think it's important that you do have sessions of coming together and being able to talk and support each other because what happens for some people is when they go solo, if they go off on their own, they don't have a lot of connections with other people in the field. And so they're here they are seeing 30 people a week they're of their clients, but they're not necessarily interacting with anybody in the field, and so they get very, very isolated in that way. And I see
Mm.
that within like the bigger practices was definitely my experience. Like, you can have 25 clinicians, but those are 25 individual entities under an umbrella. And we know just from other businesses that that usually creates a lot of just disconnect. And so the idea there is there's no cohesion in that idea because although you are meeting the needs of a greater community, of course, but at the same time, like it lacks the foundation internally to be able to kind of unify anybody, I think. And what it does, at least in my experience, what it typically does is that it creates a lot of, well, this is the right way and this is the wrong way to do it. When really maybe both ways are probably right. There's just a more effective way of doing it. And so you kind of run into a lot of that kind of thing. At least I experienced that, versus a smaller place where you maybe have four or five people who kind of have a closer relationship and they're more kind of so more or less on the same page in that way.
Yeah, because I think that getting those clinicians together or those therapists together, they can share their experiences, they can learn from each
Hmm.
other and discuss on a better way that might work. And so they can learn from each other and improve their own skills because somebody else might have more experience in that particular
Yep.
issue.
And I made a comment on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, and a lot of people responded to it. And it was because basically, I don't understand the therapist to therapist war. There's this internal like friction between therapists, and I'm not exactly quite sure why that is. Some of it might come from a perspective that there's a little bit of an ethical idea that if you know somebody's doing something that's unhealthy, that you're supposed to report them, which I think it's more of like, what's the context there? You're just like anything, there's a lot of different things that have come up with certain ideas like that. But this idea that there's this therapist to therapist, dissension doesn't make a lot of sense because we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to help other people and including ourselves, become healthier and stronger versions of each other. And why would we want to, put um more friction there, fraction, I guess, fraction. Why do I want to break that more apart more than it already is? And I think that that's something that is within the field anyway, and that's a uphill battle. That as a coach, I see that sort of a toward other other clinicians having a lot of negative things to say about other clinicians. So that's something that's within the field itself too.
Well, see, that's negative talk, and I think that that's part of culture, and that's where the boss comes in because culture filters down from the top, really, and
Yep.
that's where they need to keep in touch with all of their therapists and clinicians and whoever else they employ to make sure the attitudes are healthy, you know?
I'd agree. Yep. Yeah, one of the things, the greatest like loss or the worst thing an owner can do is not be an owner. And that's what a lot of them don't want to be owners. They want to be owners in name only. But to be an owner means you're going to be a leader. And to be a leader means you have to do things that are much more challenging than necessarily what you're taught to do. Even though you have the skill set to do it, it may not be comfortable, but you have to do it because that's the role you've taken on. And I think that's one of the things that's really hard to accept when you've stepped into that role.
So, what is your ultimate reason for wanting to help? Uh, these businesses.
Well, I don't want people to experience a lot of what I dealt with. Some of those things are my own doing. Some of the things were things I didn't learn in school. Some of the things were experiences I had in different places. And to me, I think that the biggest thing that we can do to try to make the field better, right, is we hear a lot of things in society right now about, mental health crisis and, problems of mental health and lack of mental health and those kind of things. And there is some truth to some of those things. I mean, certainly there are a great number of clinicians, and there are always kind of like teachers, there's a lot of clinicians that are leaving the field for various reasons. But I do think that the main overall thing is if we can try to make some of these practices stronger, more succinct, more healthy, that will help clinicians to feel more secure in what their job is. Now, there's always going to be a level of being a clinician where I wouldn't use the word job security, but I would say that it feels like that can be very minimal at times. Like just because, again, like we said, there's a lack of consistency sometimes. There's all this stuff with AI that's been coming out and how that's changing the field and changing the world really. But ultimately, there's a lot of different changes that happen. But if we can try to provide some security through these businesses and practices to what we can do, let's make that be a stronger part, and overall it makes the field stronger because if these places are more consistent and therapists are able to come to work, enjoy what they're doing, enjoy being there, feel supported, then they can also provide that back to the clients. I do think clients also experience the negativity, so to speak, or the downfalls of clinics through the therapist. You can tell when your therapist's not interested in being there, or they're distracted, or whatever the case is, and they're not able to hold that space for you. And so that
Mhm.
ultimately then goes back to the clients of people who only come one time. That might be the one time that they're going to come. And if they get a bad experience, just like a restaurant, they're not going to come back. And so that's one of those kind of things where a lot of people have had negative experiences, not because of the lack of a clinician talent, but because of lack of clinician support or lack of clinician, I guess maybe continuity is the best word there within from the practice because the practice wasn't in a good place. And so for me, it's kind of like one of those things where I feel like that's an area where I know I can, in my experience, bring some expertise in that way and also be able to help people and help those practices so that they don't have that experience. Because I know as a clinician, it's frustrating to be in that position. And just from my experience I've had, and also from hearing from our people's frustrations in that same space.
Yeah, so when a customer or a client walks in the door of a practice, they can feel the kind of energy in that place. And it would start with immediately with the receptionist. And
Hmm.
so if
Yep.
the practice has um, a poor culture, the customer might go through with the reception that day, but they won't come back because they didn't feel the atmosphere was welcoming or calming, or
Mhm.
you know what I mean. So how
Yep.
that practice
Yeah.
is run and how the people are in that practice is key to making that feel good.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is if you have a lot of things that are in disarray, or there's even if it's functional chaos, that can create a lot of those types of, negative experiences. And so we want to try to minimize as many of those as we can, or at least be able to be aware of the ones we can control. There's some of them you may not be able to, but certainly the ones you can be able to keep some parameters around, I think are really important. So I would definitely agree with that. I think the culture starts with the owner, like you said, but it goes all the way down to basically the presentation, of whatever that is, and with the way the clinic is set up and the way things are and the way things are run and what we do here. So really the two big areas I think culture comes down to is relationships, and that's relationships in the practice and outside the practice, but specifically in the practice. And then the other side is what's the way we do things here? What are the things that we do consistently enough? Does it, maybe it's not important for us to have this one area perfect, but we do that fairly well as best as we can, but we're really good in this other area. And that's like our known strength in that way. So I think that that's important because you're not going to get every part perfect, but if you can get a majority of them in a strength, I think that really lends to a lot of credibility in your end.
Yeah, right. So we've talked a lot about structure and the seriousness of this business, but what about where the therapist can actually have fun as, people who work together, a team, basically? There needs to be something light-hearted because it's pretty serious business, isn't it? Helping people with
Sure.
mental health. So, what do you suggest to business owners in that regard?
Yeah, it's hard because I do think there's a little bit of that, the fact that it is sometimes it feels like it can be very serious most of the time, all the time when you're there kind of thing. But I think like you said, you gotta still also have this relational component, which all relationships have some level of enjoyment and fun, and that's important. So I definitely think that one of the big things that people can do is try to utilize certainly things that help people to feel uh, brought together as far as whether or not it's just off the top of my head, first thing I can think of is like opportunities for people to be able to share, just experiences that they've enjoyed, whether it be like a trip or something that that they find to be important, passions that they have, those kind of things. And then be able to have a voice in some of the things that we are going to do, whether they be serious or maybe not so serious. I think always giving clinicians an opportunity to be able to feel like they are part of, they're putting a little bit of the bricks in the wall, so to speak. It's not just made by somebody else and they just have to sort of kind of deal with it, but they do have a higher say in those things. I think is a big part of it, bringing some of the morale up. I can't think of anything immediately off the top of my head that's like fun. So, but like I would say that I do think, every time you can give somebody a voice, I think that definitely helps to bring more to bring some of their defensiveness down in that way.
Yeah, I could think of million things that they could do, but yeah, we won't talk about that. But I just see that that helps people. It breaks down barriers when you share something personal with
Yeah.
people, or something fun, or something funny, or you know what I mean. It breaks down barriers and just helps people get to know each other better. And I find that a good work.
I can think of one game that I used to use for some of my stuff I've done. It's like you take the M&Ms, you have M&M like a bag of M&Ms, and every M&M color has a different question on it. That would be an example of something I could think of that would be a like an
Okay,
icebreaker kind of thing.
okay.
Yeah. So
Icebreaker stuff. Yeah, yeah. Even just right, it's your turn this week to cook something homemade and bring it in for us to share, right? And
okay, yeah, like a potluck.
next week it's your turn, and the week after it's somebody else's. And so that's just, just something simple, but it
No,
just
it's a great idea.
all connect, I think, and sharing is a good way of including everybody, and I find inclusiveness good. Diversity is good, but you've got to be inclusive in a practice to some degree because you're all working for the same cause. And so, you know, you're working fairly closely with each other in that regard. So anyway,
Yeah,
they're just thoughts.
yeah. No, those are good. I could think about doing like a some kind of a project together, something where you're going out and doing something together. You're kind of again building that team camaraderie to kind of focus on how to work together in that way and maybe a different kind of setting.
It could be something to do with the community, doing something
Yeah,
together for the greater good that only takes a
yeah,
couple of hours a week or something, 1.5 hours a week, or and then the practice is actually giving back to the community, but the staff are involved in that and they have an
yeah,
interest in it somehow. I just see those sort of things as bringing people together, um, not just a business cause, but as people, as
yeah,
parents,
for sure. Those are all,
that
yeah,
sort of.
definitely great ideas.
So, would you have anything else that you can add that you want business owners or therapists to know about you and what you do, and a message that is uplifting to them, some some poignant things that you can share?
Yeah. Well, I do think that there's a lot of people who are owners that are struggling more than they necessarily want to admit it. And because I say this even as in my own business, is that like it can feel like it's all consuming. And so it's difficult to want to, or I should say it's difficult. It's easy to want to walk that alone and not to try to be open about those kind of things. And so You don't really want to sometimes admit failure in that case, and maybe it's not even failure. Maybe it's just the fact that you're not having as an easy time of it as you thought you were going to have. I know for me, there's certainly things in my business as I'm trying to do this that I'm realizing like, hey, I never a million years thought I was gonna have to navigate this thing, but I have to. And so I think, certainly as business owners, I think people are um, can definitely relate to the idea that there's you're not alone in that. And I know that's something that is cliche and we talk about all the time through mental health is our people aren't struggling or are struggling, and you're not alone in that. I do think that's also very true for business owners, right? It's kind of it's a human thing to struggle, and what can we gain from that is really the fact that like there's other people have other insights that we don't have. And one of the things I've always appreciated about that I feel like I learned at a very early age was that if I want to be the strongest person of my own that I could learn, I need to learn from our people that know more than I do. It's not because I'm not a smart person, it's because the fact that I need to get more from other smarter people than I am so that I can continue to become smarter. And so I think that's a huge thing as a business owner that um, yes, there are some quote unquote feeling helpless type of things in the field. Insurance feels helpless. Navigating some of our financial issues with our field can feel helpless. But there's also a lot of stuff you can do to make it a lot better. And so I always encourage people that like you're like we're not just shackled to just things within the realm of what we can't control, but what can we control? And what we can control is how we run a business from the inside. And that starts with us as a person and us showing up as an owner in that way. So being an owner is about stepping up and being a leader. And if you don't feel confident in being a leader, you're not going to gain that just by being isolated or by, just believing you can try harder. And you're going to need some more kind of support there. It doesn't mean you failed. It just means that you can gain some strength from that of being a stronger owner, which will make a greater impact, sort of as in a cascading way when you do those kind of things. So there wasn't one direct message, I hopefully in there, but the overall thing is that people are not your business is only as strong, I think, as you are as an owner in that way, and will only be as strong as you are as an owner.
Well, that's just a human thing. Humans like to battle on, and they don't think to go and get help. What, that they maybe
Sure.
they should need help, and I should be able to do this myself, or I will feel I will feel inadequate if I have to ask for help. There's lots of different reasons why humans do
Absolutely. Yeah.
but we can all learn more because we weren't ever born with all the answers to everything. So, it makes sense to
Yeah.
learn people who've experienced more than what we have. So, I think it's a very, very valid point that you made. So, how can people or business owners or therapists get in touch with you?
So the best way to contact me would be I definitely have a LinkedIn. So Patrick Eilers, MALPC. You can search Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. The website is Bloomworks, one word, BLOOM Works, WRKS CC.com. The email is bloomworkscc@gmx.com. So those are the best ways to get a hold of me. Any three of those channels. I also have a Patreon channel that I do that I have anything relating to podcast things I've done, different things people can purchase, etc. Eventually, all that's going to move over to the website, but right now it's all on Patreon. So patreon.com/bloomworks is the other resource there as well.
Awesome. Thank you for being on my show. It's been a pleasure to interview you,
Well,
and
thank you so much for having me.
you're very welcome. And I wish you success with everything you're doing, Patrick, because I think it's very good work that you have a vision for.
Well, I appreciate that, Kristine. Thanks so much for the interesting questions and giving me an opportunity to keep talking about this. Every time I feel like I get better at verbalizing it the more I continue to speak about it. So I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thanks again.
Thanks.